Hi everybody, I'm here with my colleagues Claes Norgren and Damian Robinson on a live podcast in this special episode of Risk Matters called Risk Matters, What Matters, where we are actually going to discuss what we think are the most important issues as we come to the end of 2024 and going into 2025. And I must note that I'm in the new studios of Easy Digital in Nicosia, in the beautiful island of Cyprus. So with that, let me get started on our first subject, which is European competitiveness. I guess it's not the most pleasant discussion, given where things are. I would say that Europe in many ways hasn't really emerged from the crisis of 2008. And what I will put out for you guys to comment on is the fact that in 2008, just before the crisis, the Eurozone GDP was similar to that of the US GDP, around $14 trillion. Today, the Eurozone GDP is about $15 trillion, whereas the US GDP is at about 27. So we can see clearly that one of the two legs of the Western alliance has done extremely well, and the other one has lagged. In the banking industry, the bank in the US with the largest market cap, JP Morgan, is at close to 700 billion, whereas our biggest lender, BNP Paribas, is at about 66. In addition to that, defense spending in Europe, where there's a war to the east and a war to the south, is at about 300 billion. And in the US, which hasn't been attacked since 1941 with the Pearl Harbor attack, defense spending is at about a trillion, so 3 times more than the European Union. And the last point that I will make, which probably most of the developed world faces, is of course the demographic challenges, which will make life quite difficult for young people coming in, who will have to pay a huge amount, perhaps, for social security as the number of young people shrinks and the number of older people grows. And of course, the longer you live, which is great, and we hope that everybody can live long, but obviously that also involves a lot of diseases and other things. So our young people may not be looking at a very bright future in terms of taxes. So with that, that's my position. Klaus, how do you see it?
Yeah, no, I think that these topics are really, from a European perspective, something that should be reflected upon. And just from my vantage point of view, just 2 observations that I think could be worthwhile to put in the equation. The first one is that I think after the big depression, so to say, in 2008, there was a lot of regulation rolled out, and especially in the European Union. And I think that there is a time for consideration on how that is done. I think it has an impact on competitiveness in many ways. And I think that there has been a slogan, better regulation, but that has been spoken about for, let's say, a decade. But it's time to go from talking to action in that. It's easy said, but it's much more difficult to make. So I think there's a big case for that. Then in terms of actually the banking industry that we work a lot with, I think that there are kind of structural lessons that was put forward in the Draghi report about Europe being a kind of banking balance sheet centric continent. So much of our savings goes into deposits or kind of liabilities. In other markets, there is a supply of risk capital by funds, by equity. And I think that there is a case to kind of promote that in Europe. So those 2 things might be 2 things to reflect upon.
Damien, how do you see it?
Well, I'm going to say a couple of things that might be a little controversial, and I'm going to maybe challenge a little bit. But I think,
please,
and all due respect to the young in the audience, but a couple of us are old enough to remember these things. But we've seen this movie before. It's and as an American, I don't mean any offense to any Europeans, but the idea of kind of the European malaise has been around for a very long time. I mean, I remember going back into the mid-'80s and early '90s, and I mean, that was what was being talked about. So on the one hand, to talk about, lack of competitiveness in Europe is not a new thing. On the other hand, even with that, Europe seems to have always, delivered in its own way. And I think we also have to think about, what does competitiveness mean? I mean, are we only talking about financials? Are we only talking about economic headline numbers? Let's not forget, competitiveness also counts when it comes to things like quality of life and and other qualitative measures. So I think we have to think about those.
So La Dolce Vita and AI sort of compete with each other in this case. Yeah. My concern, and I must say that Damian provides a little bit more of a positive view as an American living in Europe than perhaps some of the rest of us who grew up here. My concern, I guess, in addition to everything that I mentioned, is also that Europe doesn't seem to be playing a major role in the AI competition. That seems to be dominated by the US and by China. And I personally don't see, other than what Claes mentioned on the regulatory side, so there's the AI Act, which of course may be a little bit of an oxymoron, that Europe is regulating AI. The moment AI doesn't seem to be at the same level in Europe as it is in other parts of the world. So my question is, how do you guys see Europe in the whole technology competition right now, Claes?
So before answering your questions, I would just add to what Damian said. I think that the European Union for Europe should be a one-way street. Because if you consider the kind of fragmentation in Europe, there is no other way for Europe than to unite. The question is how. So being a kind of pro-European, I would just like to put that on the table. Now, in terms of the AI and technology developments, I think that it's right, as you say, Damian and Arion, that we kind of lag behind in many respects. It's not confined to AI. I think we have been at a good position in a number of countries like Sweden, where I come from, but we have kind of lost the steam in this. And I think there are many responses and answers to that. And one of them is the educational system, how that promotes kind of universities and the basis for technology development. But also, I would come back to the risk capital. Now, it's fantastic to see all the invention and how that shapes a new banking industry, and coming back to the regulatory picture, at the same time as there are these opportunities for digitalization of financial services, up comes regulations again, looming, and I think that we will have to kind of find the right balance there.
Yeah, I think, Claes said a couple of key things. I mean, the whole the way that universities are supported and their interaction with industry, I think, is a different dynamic in Europe than it is in the US. Of course, the idea of a unified Europe with larger scale and companies that are operating kind of across border, that's also an important factor. I mean, there's still, even though we have the EU and we have the community and the common market and everything, there's still a lot of localization in Europe, much more so than you find in places like the US, and that plays a role in scale.
How much of a role does risk-taking and the sort of culture of risk-taking versus risk aversion in Europe versus the US do you think plays in that? And I will also mention, seeing Claes talked about the Draghi report, that in there, it mentions that a third of the European unicorns had to go to the US in order to achieve scale. And of course, we know that we don't have the equivalent of a Silicon Valley in the European Union. Claes comes from Sweden, which probably has the most unicorns, I would think. Maybe I think it's about 10 with Klarna and with Spotify and others. But the concept of innovation has lagged behind for a while. And I wonder how much of it has to do with the sort of American sense of risk-taking and of the need to fail perhaps first before you make it big, versus in Europe where sometimes people may be a little bit afraid to fail.
I think it's a question about also the public sector and how the public sector relates to the risk capital. There is many parts of Europe kind of ambitions for social reasons or for other reasons to kind of take away risk for people. But if you take away the rewards, then you shouldn't be surprised if there is no supply of risk capital. So you have to find the markets to grow, and that has to do with tax incentives and all the rest we know, but also to establish big and liquid markets. And that is why I think, once again, Europe should be a one-way street.
So we're back to the La Dolce Vita.
La Dolce Vita is your main asset in Europe, and the history, I guess.
So can we shift gears a little bit?
Of course.
Because I have some things on my mind as well.
Let's go ahead, David.
So, one of the things that I think that, is going to be important in the next period is, and this kind of harkens to geopolitical risk, and that is, the situation in Ukraine. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the war is coming to an end, one way or the other. We don't know exactly how it's going to end, whether it's a negotiated settlement or whether it's a victory of one side or the other. But we can say that probably within 25, we'll see the end of that. And I guess what's on my mind is how that impacts Europe, how it impacts the economy, how it impacts our security situation, and the banking industry.
So what I would say on this, before I give it over to Claes, which again goes back to my rather pessimistic outlook for Europe, is the fact that the war in Ukraine will end if the main supporter of Ukraine military-wise, which is the US, decides that it ends. And it's almost like Europe doesn't play the role that it should, right? So it's almost between Trump and Putin now. And Europe, which is in the middle and geographically closer to Ukraine, doesn't even seem to be consulted. They just seem to be following behind whoever it is that's making the major decision. So I just put that there as well, because we talked about defense at the beginning, to sort of show the shrinking role that Europe is playing on the geopolitical scene in terms of the number one security issue that the continent has faced since the Second World War.
But that's why I come back to, there is a one-way street here. Because, Europe, by necessity, has to unite and play another role in defense in Europe. There is no other option. We must take responsibility for ourselves, but of course be kind of aligned with friends, and friends being happy to be aligned with friends. So that is why I think with that scenario that you're talking about, once again Europe needs to kind of build up.
So what I would say, and on this one, and I have to say it as a Greek Cypriot, is the fact that Cyprus has been occupied for 50 years and is part of the European Union. And there seems to be quite minimal pressure by our European partners on Turkey to make any movement towards ending the partition of the island. Part of that is the fact that there are certain European countries that have very big defense contracts with Turkey and don't want to jeopardize those. Of course, Turkey is a much bigger market than Cyprus is. It has a population of about 100 times more than the Republic of Cyprus does. So I think that in order for Europe to be able to come together, which I think is an admirable goal, it's very important that the European countries are supported by the European allies when it comes to disagreements or problems with non-European countries.
Oh, I see.
Damian?
I guess that's kind of a no-brainer, and
but it's not happening though.
It's not happening, the defense contracts and so forth is not only European companies and countries. It's also their partners over on the other side of the Atlantic. Which there are strategic interests that go beyond.
But I think going down a bit a level, kind of another perspective on what you raised and the kind of geopolitical tensions and Europe contra other countries and the threats that we're looking at, it is really, if you look at the development in risk with organized crime, how that translates with geopolitical interests, and how that suddenly in a new, I would say, climate changes the world. My country, Sweden, had a lot of arguments with Turkey entering into NATO. Right. But underneath, there are things in terms of the relationships between these kind of political movements who suddenly shake hands with organized crime in Europe, and where is Russia in this equation? And coming back then to financial services, how do you transact? We had a case we were reading about in Financial Times about kind of using crypto market, Bitcoin, for kind of laundering money with crime in London. And all this is now happening. So for us, when we work with banks and look at the kind of risk management there, all of a sudden, behind the usual crooks comes the whole world. The geopolitical thing comes into banking.
Yeah.
So I think, and that is a challenge not only for banks and individuals and law enforcement, but also for the cooperation among countries and NATO, Turkey, and the other countries involved. They need to kind of see this and address the risks.
It's not only organized crime, but it's also state bad actors, and I think this comes back to the discussion about AI that we talked about a minute ago. I mean, how that is really accelerating the ability for organized crime or anyone else to take over identities, to commit fraud, to spread disinformation. I mean, all these things are connected. It's on the positive side, it also gives banks an opportunity to make their controls more efficient. But it really, there's a lot of thought that needs to be done about how to do that and how to govern it.
Yeah.
So what are the top 2 or 3 things, Claes, that banks should be thinking about going into 2025?
Well, I think what they are actually doing and thinking about right now in the new year is the right track and the only track, because digital risk management needs to be there. DORA enters into place. Many banks right now, they are kind of reviewing how their new policies and processes will look in the new year. So I think that talking about technology and digitalization and risks in business and of banking, that is on the agenda, and it will be for many years. I think that the kind of combination of technologies, cloud, digital technologies, and also generative AI, the combination of this is kind of technology 2.0 in the banking industry, and that strategically for banks needs to be considered a lot. And I think in RiskMatters we will actually discuss this.
But yeah, Damian, what do you see for 2025?
Well, again, I go back to the geopolitical, and I think this. We've got Ukraine and what's going to happen there. If the war ends in the new year or sometime during 2025, how is that going to impact the Russia sanctions? How is it going to impact energy? I mean, with the economic conditions in Europe and the need to grow cheaper energy, looks pretty good right now. And I don't think that. Obviously there are political motivations for the way that the market has, been the last couple of years, but I don't know if that's going to last forever if the security situation changes. So I think, we'll probably see a push to recultivate relationships with Russia in terms of energy eventually. I don't know exactly what the timing is, but
You asked for 2 things, and the other thing I would add to that, and it relates to what you said, Damien, and that has to do with sustainability, climate risk, and ESG. And I think that this is something that is being worked with also in the banking industry. But we now see something very interesting in terms of risk, that moving the transition to the green economy is not that simple. In Sweden, we had a recent case of a new technology being invested in, But how easy is it to get up the production? How is world demand looking for electric cars? How soon will these investments bear fruit?
You're talking about the Northvolt
I'm talking
case.
about that. Oh, yeah.
The 30 billion, or no, 15 billion.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And what I'm certain of is that Northvolt is not just one company.
Yeah.
They have cousins all over the
Right.
place. And I think that with a kind of promotion, one must have in mind that it will be non-performing green assets coming around. And so this is much more complicated real life. And that is, I guess, when it comes to business, kind of implementing the political ambitions. And that will have a cost.
So I think that when it comes to ESG and the green transition, I think it's very important that governments be able to put some sort of price tag on it so that the taxpayers know how much this is all going to cost going forward. Because I worry many times when I hear the politicians speaking across Europe that they use this green transition as a slogan, but there isn't really any explanation behind A, what it means, B, what it costs, C, what sort of impact it will have on the economy. And so I think in order to be able to build consensus around that and to be able to keep the momentum behind it, it's very, very important that the value proposition, if you will, for European taxpayers is clear when it comes to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this relates to the concept of use cases, and we were talking about this the other day with a CRO of a bank that we know, and talking about sort of the idea of the green agenda being pushed, but we're really not sufficient evidence as to whether the initiatives that are being taken will actually have the right kind of impact.
If it's 1 degree Celsius or 1.5 or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that's hard to know. I mean, until you look in the rearview mirror. But at the same time, we have to ensure that people are taking actions because there's actually a need for them in terms of the market, what the consumers want to use versus sort of a regulatory mandate that is for something that nobody really wants or needs.
But I think also that if you look at these ESG and the climate issues and the political agenda there, that has been kind of been rolled out and that goes into, in a way, implementation. There is an immense risk for regulatory failures. I mean, what is green or not? For many years, it was considered as a no-go zone to invest in defense industry.
Or nuclear.
Yeah.
Or nuclear. Yes.
And now, I mean, we see nuclear power plants reducing the emissions of carbon in the world, being very effective from that perspective. Suddenly, defense spending to assist Ukraine is not considered something to be a no-go zone. So, I mean, there are all sorts of practical issues like that where the potential for regulatory failures to be extremely big.
So, as we close, one quick prediction. When we sit down next year, God willing, and do this again, will we be in a better economic shape than we are today? Klaus?
I think we will still be shoveling through.
Damian?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard to say, but I see the instability that we've been seeing being extended.
Yeah.
Especially with what's going on in the Middle East. That's a big worry that we haven't talked about. And lots of other things going on. I think, you need stability to have a good economic environment, and I just don't see stability, sort of being in the cards in the very near future.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I do think that there are a lot of challenges. It's not necessarily the economic challenges in the sense of just sort of looking at the numbers, but it's all the geopolitical risk that something new seems to be happening every day. The Assad regime fell in about 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, I don't think that many people would have sort of seen it coming. So I agree. Get the shovels out and buckle up. And but let's hope that we have a good 2025. With that, let me thank you very much for that, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody in the next episode of Risk Matters.
Thanks.
Thank you.